I've been sleepwalking lately, and tonight I'm turning myself into the police. By user Casey Verilian. Missing: James Turner. Height 5 foot 8 inch. Hair color brown. Eye color blue. Weight 200 pounds. Age at time of disappearance 28. I kept reading the words on the flyer over and over in my head. I never thought I would be spending my second wedding anniversary looking for my husband. He had disappeared a few days before, and the police were out of leads. I was spending my days and nights searching and putting up posters. Things had been rough between us lately. He had lost his job and money was tight, but it wasn't anything to run away over. He didn't have any enemies, no one would want him to disappear. He had left late that fateful night to help his friend whose truck broke down. I was getting ready for bed, and then I woke up in the morning. He wasn't next to me. I called his friend, who said James should have been home hours ago. He started to drive the trek to our house searching for James as I called the police. It only took them a few hours to find his truck abandoned in a parking lot. He loved that truck. He never would have left it with the keys in the ignition and the doors open. When the police told me they found it, they didn't think I could hear their radios buzzing with talk of blood in and around the truck. I think the officers saw my face drain of color because they quickly turned their radios off. They assured me that they would find my husband, that I shouldn't worry. That night, I laid awake in bed, wondering where we went wrong, why he would leave. At some point, I must have drifted off because suddenly I was dreaming about him. He laid on the ground, his shoulder-length hair laying almost like a halo in a pool of blood. He was gasping for air, and as he reached for me with a shaking hand, I woke up. Panicking and drenched in sweat, I made my way to the light switch. As soon as I saw the blood on the switch and where it was dry and crusting on my hands, I dropped to the floor sobbing. I showered, inspecting myself for wounds, and found nothing. I spent hours cleaning the blood from my walls and bed. Exhausted, I fell back asleep, and when I woke up in the morning, I managed to convince myself it was a dream. I spent most of the day at the police station answering questions. They asked me if I had any debts, maybe some angry former co-workers. They even asked me about our marriage and if he had taken a lover. I answered all the questions, but the answers didn't change much. James had led a very bland life. He was quiet and level-headed. He didn't yell or scream even when we had our worst arguments. I told the police he had depression, but he had been in therapy and had finally found a combination of medications that worked for him. We had always been extremely open and honest about mental health. He hadn't said anything to me about struggling with anything in months. Sure, he was down about losing his job, but it was just a temporary thing. The police jotted down notes, and by the time the sun was setting, they let me go home. That night led to even more restless sleep than the previous night. I tossed and turned, feeling the heavy weight of emptiness on his side of the bed. Instinctively, I would reach out to touch him, and the cold sheets where his warm body once laid were like a shock to my system. That night, my nightmares returned, and this time I found myself in the mouth of a cave I often visited as a child. It was cold and damp, and there was a tinge of iron in the usually musky air. In my head, I had a pair of scissors, and I could hear muffled noises coming from deeper in the cave. I crept inside, and in the dim light emanating from the mouth of the cave, I could see my husband, tied to a chair. There was blood matted to his hair, and he looked to be unconscious. There was a second chair next to him. In it sat a young woman, probably around 20. She had long blonde hair and had twigs and leaves scattered through its knots. There was tape over her mouth, and mascara stained her cheeks as her tears flowed freely. Like my husband, she was bound to the chair, her ankles tied to the legs, and her arms were behind her back and strapped to the backing of the chair. As I walked towards them, I reached out to touch my husband's cheek, when the woman's muffled screams filled the air. I once again awoke with a start. My knees were covered in musky dirt, and in my hands were strands of long blonde hair. I was confused and exhausted, but I didn't have time to focus on my confusion. Even though it was earlier than I typically woke up, I figured there wasn't any point in going back to bed. The police had scheduled a press conference that day, and they asked me to speak at it. Where we didn't have any leads on where my husband could be, they hoped my pleas would either convince my husband to come home or to encourage anyone who knew anything to come forward. I spent my morning on the phone with my family, who were trying so hard to give me comfort from half a continent away. But nothing they said could ease the pain and confusion I felt. I flipped between anger and despair, and loneliness and confusion as the day wore on. When it came time to get ready for the press conference, I just sat staring at my closet. There, peeking out behind all the clothes, was the bag that contained my wedding dress. That bulky white bag was like a backdrop for the memories that ran through my head. All of our dates, our arguments, our plans and dreams kept swirling in my head. In between the painful and bittersweet memories, the image of my husband and that woman in the cave sprang into my mind. I could see flashes of the scissors jutting towards the woman. I shook my head, assuming it was stress and my brain trying to cope with my husband's absence. I quickly got dressed and made my way to the police station for the press conference. By the time I arrived, there were already crowds of people surrounding the police station, and I was rushed inside by two large and intimidating police officers. When I stepped inside the police station, it was buzzing with activity. There were officers answering phone calls, taking notes, and talking amongst themselves in front of a large chalkboard on wheels. On it was a photo of my husband and a photo of the women from my dreams. One of the officers must have noticed the change in my expression while I stared at the board. He quickly explained to me that one of my husband's former co-workers was reported missing that morning. They had found her car in a similar way, doors open, keys in the ignition, and small spots of blood on the driver's seat. It was abandoned on the side of the road leading north out of town. As of that moment, the only connection she had to my husband was their once shared workplace. The police told me they weren't sure how the two of them going missing were connected, but they told me they had seen cases like this before, two young people having an illicit affair and running away to be together. Tears streamed down my face as flashes of my husband smiling at his phone and staying late at work came bubbling up in my memory. I shook my head. We were still newlyweds. He loved me. There was no way it was an affair. I asked the police if they thought there was any way it was their workplace that was being targeted, and they assured me they were exploring all the possibilities. The news conference came and went in a flash. I don't remember making my desperate pleads. I don't remember what all I said. All I remember is the unsurmountable urge to bring my husband home. The reporters were already aware of the missing woman and that she was my husband's co-worker. They bombarded me with questions about them. If I knew her, had I seen them together, and if the police were sure they had not faked their deaths to be together. I think the press officers saw the hurt in my eyes at the reporters' veiled accusations, because he quickly stepped in and took over answering the questions. I quickly left the makeshift stage and found myself weeping in a back room at the station. By the time I made it home, I was absolutely exhausted. I crawled into bed and quietly cried myself to sleep. My dreams were different. I was at home, in bed, when I heard my husband come in the front door. He silently crept in the bedroom and started undressing. I could see grease and oil stains on his clothes from his friend's car. He must not have noticed that I was awake. His phone buzzed as he was changing, and after checking it, his face went red with anger. He tossed the phone next to me and stormed off to the bathroom. I looked at the phone before the screen locked. It was a message from his co-worker. It talked about how she was planning on telling me the truth. I woke up from that dream crying. Over the days I had been doing research on missing persons and the support of their families. One posting I saw online stressed that you will go through a ton of different thoughts, and sometimes your mind gets so stressed you start thinking of and dreaming of what you will feel would be the worst case scenario. I guess my mom thought that the worst thing that could have happened was him leaving me for another woman. I spent all day hanging up flyers and going to his normal hangout. No matter what my mind wanted me to think, I wasn't willing to give up on James. I felt like everywhere I turned, I would see him out of the corner of my eye. When I got home that night, there was a police officer waiting for me. They asked me if they could collect his laptop to look for more evidence. Without a thought, I let him in to collect it. As he was leaving, he noticed some blood drops on the carpet and asked me about them. I told him I must have cut myself at some point because I really don't know or remember how they got there. He gave me a hard and cold stare before leaving with my husband's laptop. At this point, I was starting to get worried. There was that night I woke up covered in blood, then the mud, and now there were mysterious blood drops on my floor. I resolved to use my phone to record my bedroom at night. I'm not sure what I was expecting to film, but I left the light on in the hallway hoping that I could figure out what was happening. What I caught on the video was nothing I anticipated. That night, I decided to sleep in one of James's shirts. The smell of his deodorant and cologne brought me a small bit of comfort as I drifted off to sleep. Then the dream started. I was back in the cave. My husband and that woman were still there. James was pale and sweating as if he had deep fever. He had cuts on his body that were almost pulsating with pus. The woman's long hair had been cut off in jagged swipes. She had apparently struggled against her bonds because her chair was tipped over and her face was resting in a puddle of stagnant cave water, while a large rat chewed at an open wound on one of her arms. Her eyes were closed, but they snapped open when she heard my footsteps coming towards them. As I stood over her, her body shuddered with deep guttural cries. I woke up in my bed the moment my boot made contact with her head. I was so shaken I almost forgot about the camera. I stood up to make myself some coffee, and as I went to walk down the hallway to the kitchen, I tripped over my boot. The bottom of it was covered in mud, blood, and strands of blonde hair. I suddenly remembered my phone and ran to check it. Watching the video, I was absolutely horrified. You could clearly see me standing up out of bed, walking to my husband's side of the bed. I then stood there for several minutes, seemingly staring at it. I then went to my closet and dressed myself. I walked out of the room, and I could hear the faint hum of my car's engine starting. Hours later I returned, and the sound of my boot being tossed on the hall floor was audible. When I entered the bedroom, I removed my clothes and put them in the laundry basket. I curled back up in bed, and awoke about 15 minutes later. What's truly terrifying is I don't remember doing any of this. I mean, I had been having weird dreams, but they're just dreams, right? I did some research on sleepwalking, and apparently extreme amounts of stress can cause you to suddenly start sleepwalking when you have no history of doing it. It's not uncommon to go through some sort of extreme trauma and then begin doing things in your sleep that you normally wouldn't. Could the sleepwalking and the weird dreams be a byproduct of my pain? Could it be the overwhelming feeling of loss and guilt over my missing husband? I decided I wasn't going to play guessing games. At some point in the shuffle of reports and questioning, one of the officers on my husband's case had given me a business card for a local psychologist. I dragged to my purse until I found a car and dialed the number on it as quickly as I could. A husky man answered. He seemed friendly enough, and when I explained who I was, he told me that he had been expecting a call from me. Apparently he had a cancellation and was able to squeeze me in for an appointment that afternoon. The office was small and peaceful, and the psychologist was very kind. Since this was our first meeting, he spent more time going over what to expect from seeing him and getting to know me than he did addressing the elephant in the room. He thought he knew why I was there. My husband was missing, and I was caught in a place between mourning a loss and hope for my husband's return. He was a little taken aback when I interrupted him to ask him about sleepwalking. He coughed slightly and asked me to elaborate. Not wanting to mention the blood and dirt, I told him that without my husband I was alone at night and that I was noticing little things being moved around the house while I slept. The psychologist eyed me up and down and calmly confirmed some of what I read online. He studied me closely and suggested that I purchase one of those little cameras you can strap to your body. He thought it may bring me some peace of mind to see if it was actually me moving the stuff in the house and that it would subconsciously reassure me that no one else was in the house with me. We casually chatted the rest of the time he had allotted for my appointment, and as soon as I pulled out of the parking lot, I went straight to our local electronics store. I managed to find a little action camera I could afford, along with a chest harness. That night, I made sure that all my clothes and shoes were clean and away. I put my car keys in the drawer and I strapped on my new little observer. It took a while to find a position to sleep in where the camera straps weren't digging into my shoulder and where I didn't think I would roll over and crush the camera. I stared at the ceiling, waiting, thinking about the last few days as I waited for sleep to take me. My husband was gone. I was having terrifying nightmares and I was most likely sleepwalking. I didn't know if it was all connected, but I was going to find out in the morning. Before I knew it, I had slipped into another horrifying nightmare. I was back at the cave and I had a baseball bat with me. The woman was still laying on her side, strapped to the chair, with her face in the bottle. Her body shuddered with deep labored breaths and the back of her head looked caved in. James sat upright in his chair, his skin even more discolored than before. His body was covered in splotchy green and purple marks, while his face was a vibrant, angry shade of red. He was shaking violently, and I couldn't be sure if it was because he was cold or because the infection in his wounds had finally set in. As I stepped closer, his head weakly lifted, and his eyes fluttered open to meet mine. I had never seen a more terrified look on his face. His mouth opened and it looked as though he was trying to talk, but I couldn't hear a sound. As though I was in trance, I turned away from him and towards the woman. I brought the bat above my head and with all the force I could muster, I slammed it down on the side of her head. The sound of bone-shattering contact quickly gave way to morbid squelches as the floor and walls of the cave became painted in her brain matter. Once her skull had been mostly emptied of its contents, I turned to James. Tears rolled down his cheeks as he mouthed the words, "I love you." But before he could finish, the bat made contact with his right temple. The force of the blow flung him backwards, and I walked over him and the chair he was tied to. His face was quickly being coated with blood, and my heart ached. I swung the bat down on his face over and over until the look of pure terror had been demolished. As I pulled the bat up from the final crushing blow, it caught something. Feeling it snag, I looked down and saw the camera mounted on my chest. In that moment of recognition, I fell to the floor gasping. It was like a violent jolt ripping me out of a nightmare, just to have reality cut me down. Their blood mixing on the floor coated my hands and knees as I violently retched. I looked around me and realized they were never dreams. I did all of this. The memories came back to me in a flood. The text, me confronting him, the argument, him insisting we take a drive to clear our heads, me hitting him with a wrench he kept in the glove box, taking the chairs out of the bed, of the trunk, and leaving him in the cage, her sitting outside my house sobbing over her lost lover, me coaxing her out, and hitting her with the crystal decanter James's father gave us as a wedding gift, loading her in the trunk of her own car and tying her up next to James. I remember him trying to tell her he loved her. I remember driving their cars and walking home. I remember everything. I've been sitting on the floor of the cave, trying to process what all has happened this last week or so. Do you understand how I could do this and not remember? How I could sleepwalk and manage to kill 2 people? I held James's hand as his chest shuddered with his last breath, and I can only hope it brought him some small comfort. Once I finish typing this, I'm going straight to the police and turning myself in. I don't want to think about it, but the camera I've been wearing should hold more than enough information for them to figure out what happened. I wish there were some deep moral values I could impart on you as you read this, but there isn't. This was purely for me to try and reconcile what has happened, and so that no matter what happens to me, James's and that woman's family will know the truth. I didn't intend for this to happen, and I hope to God I never sleepwalk again.